The first hint of morning light filtered into Ben Collins's cramped yet lively apartment studio, revealing half-finished sculptures strewn across the concrete floor. He was in his early 30s and had been sculpting since he could remember, ever since he first carved little figurines from the soap bars in his childhood home. His talent had carried him through art school and into a budding career, but he now found himself at a standstill. The ideas that once poured out of him so easily had dried up. No matter how many hours he spent hunched over his clay and tools, nothing stirred his imagination enough to spark the passion he remembered so vividly. It had been months of this stagnation. At first, he'd tried to force himself to sculpt through the block, but that only resulted in forced, lifeless pieces. Then he tried distractions, visiting museums, flipping through art books, browsing design magazines, but nothing seemed to reignite his creativity. This morning he stood at his workbench, staring at the clay the same way he might stare at a blank page. He ran a hand through his wavy brown hair, letting out a low sigh. Another day, another struggle, he muttered to himself. He knew he couldn't keep going like this. He needed an idea, something fresh, something bold. Several hours later, he found himself at the local art supply store, absent-mindedly browsing for anything that might energize his dormant imagination. At the checkout counter, he chatted with a friend of his named Mark, an illustrator who had known Ben since their university days. "Man, you look drained," Mark said, concern evident in his expression as he rang up a set of specialty sketching pencils Ben had decided to buy. Ben sighed. "That obvious, huh?" Mark nodded, then leaned across the counter. "You ever try stepping away from clay altogether for a bit? Maybe experiment with something else until you get that spark back?" Ben tilted his head, considering. He'd sculpted almost exclusively in clay, metal, or wood. Experimentation for him usually meant new techniques, not new mediums. But perhaps Mark had a point. "I've been thinking about it," Ben said. "Sketching more, maybe painting, or working with references I haven't used before." Mark paused, glancing around to make sure no one else was waiting behind Ben. "Why not get a figure model or two? Might help you see shapes differently." "I could," Ben replied, "but maybe something more radical." He gave Mark a faint smile. "I'll think on it." He left the store with a modest bag of art supplies, feeling a spark of motivation just from trying something different. That night, he sat by his living room window, the city lights glimmering outside, and began making quick pencil sketches. His style was usually grounded in realism, but something about his frustration with repetitive forms led him to draw more fluid lines, experimenting with angles and silhouettes that blended masculine and feminine details. He found the results intriguing. Eventually, the shape of a figure emerged on his sketch pad. Slender limbs, a graceful waist, but with hints of muscular definition in the arms. It was an androgynous outline that caught his eye in a way none of his previous sketches had. He felt a thrill, a faint reminder of the excitement he used to feel when a new idea took hold. The next few days he filled page after page in this vein, refining these fluid forms. He grew fascinated by how the drape of a garment could obscure or highlight the body. Typically, he had stuck to classical nudes or standard references in his sculptures, but now his mind was drawn to the interplay of fabric and shape. He noted how a long skirt might flow around a thigh, or how a blouse might shift around the shoulders. Yet even with these sketches, he realized he needed better references. He wanted something real to study, something he could touch or photograph in a variety of poses. Initially, he tried to find male and female models who would represent these fluid forms, but none of them captured the exact concept he wanted. All the while, he kept drawing, feeling a gap between the sketches and what the actual sculpture could be. One evening, in a moment of restless curiosity, Ben looked at his own reflection in the tall mirror by the hallway. He turned sideways, imagining how certain clothes would drape on him if he were wearing something loose and flowing. The thought was unusual. He had never once considered himself the subject for such an experiment, especially not in that manner. But if he couldn't find a model with the right blend of shapes, maybe he could improvise by studying his own body. At first, he tried just taking pictures of himself in form-fitting clothes, basic t-shirts, jeans, to capture body contours. That helped, but only in a limited way. The lines in his sketches required more flair, the kind that came from more traditionally feminine garments. His reluctance to approach someone else to pose in that style stewed in the back of his mind. Then, the idea, almost a whisper at first, began to take hold. What if he wore women's clothing to see how it fell on a figure like his? The suggestion both intrigued and unnerved him. He could already hear the snickers he'd get if he asked around for items to borrow or approached a friend for help. But the idea wouldn't let go, and that night he lay awake with the thoughts spinning in his head. He told himself it was purely for art, purely to understand fabric flow and posture. The rest, he insisted, was irrelevant. Despite lingering hesitations, he found a small thrift store in a part of the city where people seldom recognized him. Nervously, he selected a few garments, a flowy skirt, a simple blouse, a dress. He didn't linger, and he avoided eye contact with the cashier. Walking out, he realized how fast his heart was beating, as if he'd done something scandalous. Yet there was a sense of excitement too, like he was stepping into an entirely new creative dimension. Back in his apartment, he locked the door and drew the curtains before pulling the clothing out of the bag. He set each piece on the bed, smoothing out wrinkles carefully. The skirt was navy blue with a soft drape. The blouse had a delicate pattern of tiny flowers. The dress was simple, but featured flared sleeves and a somewhat cinched waist. They smelled faintly of laundry detergent, an unremarkable scent, except that now they felt like forbidden treasures on his bed. He hesitated for a long time before trying any of them on. Finally, recalling that it was all in service of his sculpture, he slipped into the skirt first. The sensation was unlike anything he had felt before. Cool air against parts of his legs he wasn't used to exposing. The waist hugged him snugly, and looking in the mirror, he observed how the material flowed just below his knees. Even in that moment, he noticed how his posture changed, how he stood differently just wearing it. "Okay," he said under his breath, as though trying to calm himself. "Let's see if this helps." He set up his camera on a tripod, used the timer function, and began taking a series of reference photos. He posed in front of a neutral background, turning slowly so the garment would catch the light in different ways. Then he switched to the blouse, took more pictures, then the dress. Each time, he observed how the silhouette shifted. He even tried walking back and forth, capturing video so he could watch how the fabric moved around him. Throughout the process, he was surprised by how focused he felt. The intimidation or nervousness he'd expected gradually eased, replaced by a keen concentration on the way the clothes interacted with his body. The night ended with hundreds of digital shots and a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in months. He reviewed the images on his computer, making quick sketches from the stills, capturing the lines of the garments across shoulders, along hips, around arms. As the hours stretched on, he caught himself smiling, really smiling, at the possibilities forming in his mind. The next morning, with a slight ache in his back from leaning over the table for so long, he set about sculpting for the first time in weeks with genuine enthusiasm. He molded a small clay figure, about a foot tall, using the references he had just created. The result was a figure that blended masculine muscle structure in the arms with gentle flowing curves around the legs. Draped across the waist was a skirt, delicately carved in clay folds. The posture emanated both strength and grace. When he finished, he took a step back to admire it. Something about it resonated with him deeply. This was new ground, a shape he'd never pursued in his earlier works. The form was at once robust and tender. He felt a quiet thrill. A few days later, he met Mark at a local cafe for a late lunch. They sat outside, sipping iced coffees as pedestrians bustled by. Mark was flipping through a few photos on his phone from a recent illustration project. "So, what's new with you?" Mark asked, turning off his screen and looking up. "You sounded excited when you messaged me. Found some new inspiration?" Ben hesitated. There was no way he felt ready to reveal the details of how he'd found that inspiration. He fumbled for a vague explanation. "I started using some personal references for an androgynous figure. It's pushing me in a fresh direction." Mark's eyes lit up. "That's great, man. I could see you doing something edgy. You've always been good at capturing anatomy, but maybe flipping it on its head is what you needed." "Exactly," Ben replied, grateful that Mark didn't press for more specifics. After they'd discussed Mark's latest work and parted ways, Ben hurried back to his studio. He felt a surge of anticipation for the new sculpture he wanted to start that afternoon, building on that earlier small piece. The only slight shadow over his excitement was a quiet confusion about how he felt when he was in the clothes. It had started purely for references, but at moments he found himself lingering in front of the mirror a bit too long, strangely comfortable in the fabric. He couldn't reconcile that awareness with the satisfaction he found in the sculpting results. He tried to dismiss the personal angle, focusing on the artistic benefits alone. But the more he worked, the more he realized that the softness of the garments and the shift in posture changed not just how he posed, but how he thought about shape. Something about wearing them expanded his perspective. He carved details into the clay with an attentiveness he'd long believed lost. A week passed, and he decided to purchase more clothes. His earlier items were helpful, but he wanted additional garments to vary the references for his next set of sculptures. With each new blouse or skirt he tried, he'd photograph or film himself, then quickly transfer these insights to the workbench. The synergy was undeniable. Yet a complication arose in his personal life. His partner, Alicia, noticed a distinct shift in his routine. They'd been together for a little over a year, and though they were both fairly independent, she still observed that he was spending more late nights at the studio, sometimes forgetting to reply to her texts or calls until hours later. She stopped by unannounced one evening, entering his studio to find him wearing a baggy t-shirt and sweatpants, hair disheveled, with clay smeared across his forearms. A half-formed sculpture towered on the workbench. "Hey," she said, stepping carefully to avoid lumps of stray clay on the floor. Ben jumped in surprise, quickly turning away from the draped garment that hung on a nearby rack. He forced a smile. "Alicia, didn't know you were coming." She approached him, giving him a quick peck on the cheek and scanning the studio. "I hadn't heard much from you this week. You're really in the zone, huh? Something's changed. You used to be so frustrated, and now—" She gestured to the sculpture. "This looks fantastic." "It's a new direction," he said quietly. "Something that sort of hit me recently. I'm experimenting with forms that feel different from what I've done before." Alicia leaned in to look at the sculpture. "It's stunning. Male and female traits blended together so naturally. I've never seen you do something like this. You should be proud." A wave of relief washed over him. He had worried she might sense something amiss, that he was concealing details of his process. Though she clearly saw that he was more inspired, he wasn't ready to reveal precisely how he'd arrived there. He wrapped an arm around her. "Thanks. It's the first time in a while I've felt a genuine spark." "Maybe we can celebrate soon," she said. Then she cast a curious glance toward a garment rack that was partially hidden behind a canvas drape. "What's that?" Ben felt his chest tighten. He casually stepped forward, blocking the rack from full view. "Oh, that's just some reference outfits. Long story. It's for the drapery. I'm trying to see how certain folds fall." She accepted the explanation with a shrug, smiling. "I'd love to see your references sometime, but I also know how private you can be about your process." "Yeah," he murmured, relieved she wasn't pushing. "I'll, show you eventually." They ordered takeout that night, and she stayed to keep him company in the studio. He told her more about the conceptual goals of this new series, focusing on blending unexpected aspects of form, though he never admitted his part in modeling the clothes. By the time she left, he felt both close to her and strangely distant, as though a veil had formed between them that he hadn't intended to create. His sculptures continued to evolve, each piece more daring than the last. Soon he had a cohesive collection forming in his studio, 8 figures, all around 2 to 3 feet tall, each one exploring unique variations of muscle definition paired with softly curved lines. Some appeared to wear a skirt or a robe carved delicately from the clay. Others were poised in thoughtful poses that evoked quiet confidence. When he looked at them lined up side by side, he felt a rush of accomplishment. This series was the first time in a long while he truly felt he had broken new ground. Still, he kept refining. Whenever he needed new angles or wanted a fresh fabric texture, he'd slip into the outfits, sometimes a blouse with wide sleeves or a gown with flowing panels. He discovered that different fabrics could inspire entirely new shapes in clay, so he continued adding to his wardrobe. Oddly, the process wasn't just utilitarian. A part of him began to enjoy the shift in energy he felt the moment he dressed in these garments. He found he stood straighter, moved more gently, and examined himself in the mirror with a fascination he couldn't completely explain. But caution always accompanied that curiosity. He was deeply aware of how the rest of the world might react. He lived in a progressive city, true, but the idea of publicly embracing cross-dressing as part of his artistic routine felt beyond daunting. And what about Alicia? Would she understand, or would she see it as something bizarre or off-putting? Each time he wrestled with these questions, he decided it was easier to keep the secret under wraps for now. One afternoon, as he was working on the detailing of a new sculpture, Mark stopped by unexpectedly. Ben nearly jumped out of his skin because he had just removed a lace dress a few minutes prior and had stashed it behind a partially closed closet door. Mark, oblivious to Ben's sudden tension, walked around the studio, eyes wide. "Dude, you're on fire!" Mark exclaimed, pointing to the array of sculptures. "These are brilliant. Where's all this coming from?" Ben managed a casual shrug. "Just ideas I've been bouncing around. I guess you could say I'm focusing on blending different energies into one piece." Mark grinned. "Well, it's working. And listen, I told a few contacts in the local art scene that you're sitting on a potential showstopper. They might want to feature you in an upcoming exhibition." That made Ben's heart soar. He'd had modest success before, but it had never felt so personal or so resonant. "Wow, that's amazing news. Thanks for spreading the word." Mark's eyebrows rose in excitement. "Anytime. Just keep me posted if you want me to put in a good word. You know I've got some connections from the last gallery I worked with." "I appreciate it," Ben said. He tried not to fidget, silently praying Mark wouldn't decide to open any closets or rummage around. Over the next several weeks, word of Ben's emerging sculptures began to trickle through the local art circles. A small but respected gallery invited him to submit pieces for an upcoming group show themed around transformation. Ben saw it as a perfect fit, especially since he was informally calling his new collection Metamorphosis. The pressure to refine and present his best work only increased. If he wanted to stand out, he needed to push the boundaries further. One evening, he stared at the half-finished figure before him, arms locked at his sides, while the city buzzed outside his open window. He realized that the garment on the figure's torso, sculpted to mimic a soft blouse, felt incomplete. He needed to capture the exact folds and angles more precisely than he ever had. Without giving it a second thought, he walked to his closet, pulled out the blouse from the hanger, and slipped it on. Then he stood in front of the mirror and studied the lines on his shoulders, the way the fabric naturally fell over his upper arms. The reflection that stared back was strangely comforting. A quiet voice inside him recognized that he wasn't merely wearing these clothes for references anymore. Something else stirred beneath the surface, though he wasn't ready to pin a name to it. He grabbed his sketchbook, made quick notes on how the sleeves framed his arms, then reached for the camera to capture the angles from different perspectives. An hour or so later, he used that detailed reference to shape the clay, pressing it gently with his fingertips, smoothing the form until it had the crisp, intricate detail he'd wanted. That night, as he finally unwound on the sofa, he realized just how deep he was in this new creative process. Alicia called, wanting to plan a date for the weekend, and he heard the warmth in her voice. She mentioned how much she missed him, how she wanted to see more of his work if he was comfortable sharing. He felt guilty as he danced around the specifics of his methods. He told her he was working on something deeply personal and wasn't quite ready to reveal every detail. She hesitated on the line, then told him she trusted him. When the call ended, he sat there, phone in hand, feeling torn between relief that she respected his privacy and unease about how long he could keep such an important part of his artistic process hidden. As the date of the group show approached, he selected 4 sculptures to display. Each one showcased different aspects of the male-female fusion, carved with care and emotional intensity. The gallery owner, a stern but fair woman named Patricia Alvarez, walked through the studio to finalize which pieces would appear and how they might be arranged. She stood with her arms crossed, observing the pieces carefully, tapping her chin now and then. "Fascinating," she said, nodding. "These look deeply authentic. I can feel the vulnerability. It's refreshing to see an exploration of fluidity in sculpture like this." Ben swallowed hard, looking away. "I'm glad you think so. I wanted the shapes to feel natural, not forced." She gave him a thin smile. "They do. The lines are unique. The posture is intriguing. It's as if you've captured the essence of multiple qualities at once. You've got a real chance to impress some heavy hitters in the art community with these. It's a crowded field, but these stand out." He thanked her, and the conversation moved on to logistics. When the pieces would be transported to the gallery, how they'd be displayed, the lighting setup. Once she left, he breathed a long sigh. This would be the biggest public unveiling of his new style. He was excited, yes, but he also knew that eyes would be on him, that people might ask about the creative process. He couldn't quite imagine the reaction if they learned he had found his main reference by donning women's clothing. Through the final days of preparation, he became increasingly consumed by details. He spent hours refining the polish on each sculpture, carefully sanding surfaces, adjusting small imperfections. Alicia called more often, noticing his stress level. She tried to be supportive. One evening, she prepared a home-cooked meal for him in her apartment, a cozy place with warm lighting and abstract paintings on the walls. Over a candlelit dinner, she reached across the table and took his hand. "Ben, I'm proud of you, but I'm also worried. You seem so wound up these days." He squeezed her hand back. "I'm okay. Just a lot riding on this show. Is there anything you want to talk about? You can tell me anything, you know." Ben hesitated. He looked into her eyes, saw the genuine care there. A part of him yearned to open up about the cross-dressing, about how comfortable he felt in those moments, how vital it was to his artistic revival. But the words stuck in his throat. His mind flashed with fears. She might feel unsettled, or see him differently, or wonder if everything about him had changed overnight. Finally, he shook his head. "It's just the pressure," he managed, giving her hand one last squeeze. "I'm grateful you're in my corner." She accepted that explanation, but on his way home that night, he felt a knot in his chest. He realized that the secrecy had started to weigh on him, yet the alternative, the possibility of her misunderstanding or pulling away, felt too risky. Opening night arrived. The gallery bustled with attendees who mingled around each displayed piece, nodding appreciatively or murmuring their observations. A local art critic was there, along with a handful of collectors who wandered from one sculptor's corner to the next. Ben wore a tailored jacket over a crisp shirt. He stood quietly near his pieces, trying not to appear too anxious, but his heart pounded with each new observer. Alicia showed up in an elegant dress and quickly found him in the crowd. "They're fantastic," she whispered, scanning the sculptures. "I've never been more impressed by your work." He exhaled, grateful for her presence. "Thanks for coming. It means a lot." She slipped an arm around him, and together they listened to the hum of conversation. One couple seemed fascinated by the interplay of lines in the second sculpture, while another man stood for a full 10 minutes before the third piece, taking notes on a small notepad. Eventually, Patricia approached with a beaming smile. "Your sculptures are drawing quite the response. People are calling them bold, intimate, and something they haven't quite seen before," she told Ben. "I think they speak to the theme of transformation in a raw way." His lips parted in a grateful smile, but inside he felt the swirl of conflicting emotions. The show was a triumph thus far. He could practically feel the tension that had plagued him for months fading under the warmth of the reception. But the real story, the private method that led him here, remained locked away. As the evening wore on, he answered questions from curious patrons. Most asked about his inspiration for bridging masculine and feminine forms. He gave them glimpses of his artistic mindset, that he'd become interested in the fluid nature of shapes, that he found it fascinating to blend qualities society often labels as opposites. The entire time, Alicia stood nearby, listening intently, occasionally nodding. After the show wrapped up, they headed back to his apartment, where a bottle of champagne waited. They popped it open and poured 2 glasses. Alicia, looking radiant, studied him carefully. "You did it. I'm so proud," she said softly, leaning against the kitchen counter. He stepped closer and wrapped an arm around her waist, taking in the warmth of her presence. "It feels unreal," he admitted, "like I've crossed a bridge and can't go back." She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "If it helped you break free from that rut, I want to hear more. Like how you discovered this style. You must have come up with something really clever to get those folds and curves so accurate." He swallowed. The question hovered between them, threatening to expose everything. Setting his champagne flute down, he led her to the sofa, and they sat. He cleared his throat, mind racing for how much he could say. "I've been using references," he started hesitantly, "but in a way that's really personal. I wanted to understand the clothes from the inside out. So, sometimes I used myself as the subject. I wore certain garments to see exactly how they draped." She looked surprised, but not scandalized. "You modeled the skirts and robes yourself?" "Yeah," he said, voice tight. "I actually purchased them and, well, I wanted to capture every fold properly. Photographs, sketches. It was more direct than hiring a model. I guess I was determined." Alicia blinked, processing his words. "That's resourceful and brave, I suppose. I never would have thought of that approach. Did it feel strange?" He managed a nervous chuckle. "At first, yeah, definitely. But then it started feeling natural to just slip on a blouse or a skirt and photograph it, like I was stepping into a different frame of mind." She took a moment to respond. "You're full of surprises. Thanks for telling me. I can see how it informed the pieces. They have this strange harmony. It's not like you're just sculpting someone else's figure. It's as though you imbued part of yourself. He studied her face, searching for any sign of discomfort. Instead, he saw curiosity and perhaps admiration. I was worried how you might react. She gave him a gentle smile. You don't have to worry. I'll admit, it's not something I expected, but I see how passionate you've become. Your work has soared because of it. If it's helping you reach new heights, then I support that. Relief flooded him, though a part of him felt he hadn't revealed everything. He hadn't explained the deeper connection he felt while wearing those clothes, the sense of calm or resonance that went beyond sculpting references. But for that night, it felt enough. He'd at least begun to peel back the curtain. As the weeks passed and the exhibition continued, visitors praised his sculptures under the collective title Metamorphosis. Critics described the series as mesmerizing and unguarded. One well-known critic for an online art magazine published a glowing article noting that Ben's work captured elements that straddled the line between distinctly human yet beyond categorization. Commission offers trickled in, and a larger gallery in a neighboring city inquired about hosting a solo exhibition. It was, by all professional measures, a resounding success. Yet in private, Ben still maintained his habit of wearing the clothes whenever he wanted fresh inspiration for new sculptures. He also found that the more often he dressed in them, the more it felt like part of a personal routine rather than an odd chore. Alicia never questioned it further, though she did notice that he kept his outfit collection mostly tucked away. Sometimes he had a fleeting thought. Perhaps he could wear them around her, show her the real process in action, but he always backed away from the idea. It felt too intimate, too charged. During late nights in the studio, if he was alone, he would occasionally catch a glimpse of himself in the mirror, wearing a new dress or a top that hugged him in different ways. He'd pose not just for the camera, but for himself. For a moment, he would forget about deadlines, critical reviews, even Alicia. He was just there, in the stillness, with the gentle swish of fabric at his thighs and the hum of city life outside. Sometimes he whispered the name Benita under his breath, a private name he had given to the version of himself in these clothes. It was a small, nearly silent act of claiming something that felt increasingly important in his life. Of course, he never allowed that name to slip out in conversation. It remained a secret between him and his reflection. He believed sharing it might complicate things. The art world had embraced the sculptures so far, but he feared how it might react if it discovered the direct origin of their authenticity. Even though Alicia had given him her blessing, he couldn't shake the sense that he should keep most details under lock and key. Around this time, Mark introduced him to a prominent curator, Serena Thompson, who expressed keen interest in expanding his Metamorphosis series into a traveling exhibit. Over a lunch meeting, Serena praised the conceptual bravery of the pieces. "You've managed to capture so many layers of identity in these forms," she told Ben. "I think a broader audience would connect with it." Ben nodded, feeling his stomach flutter. "I'm open to the idea of traveling exhibits. I do want to keep developing the series, though. I still have more to explore." "By all means do," Serena encouraged. "Push it even further. Audiences are hungry for authenticity that challenges norms. The more you dig into it, the better." He walked away from that meeting both excited and cautious. He knew that to push the series further, he'd likely delve deeper into the private practice he'd set up. He also felt a pang of worry that the deeper he went, the more attached he might become to something he still struggled to define in his day-to-day life. When he returned to his studio that afternoon, he flung open the door and surveyed the half-completed sculptures, some in raw clay, some cast in plaster. Bits of dust floated in the rays of late afternoon sunlight. He could almost sense them beckoning him to continue the work, to dive deeper. He shut the door behind him and began pulling out a new set of garments he'd picked up at a second-hand boutique last week. A long, flowing skirt, a short-sleeved blouse with an embroidered neckline, and a set of stockings. He dressed quietly, making sure the windows were covered. Each step was deliberate, pulling the skirt around his waist, smoothing it down, slipping on the blouse and tugging at the sleeves. He glanced in the mirror and recognized that look in his own eyes, a mix of tension and calm. Then he walked over to a piece of fresh clay set on a turntable, angled the mirrors around so he could see every aspect of his reflection, and began to model a figure based on what he saw. The shaping took hours. He lost all sense of time, the only awareness being the slight ache in his fingertips and the slow drip of sweat down his temple. When he finally stood back, an almost full-body figure rose from the clay, an elegant posture with arms extended as if in a gentle invitation. He took photos from multiple angles to capture the lines of the blouse. Later, he planned to refine details like the stocking texture on the lower legs. Finishing his preliminary work, he carefully eased out of the garments, folding them neatly on a chair. Even though he told himself he could keep them on a bit longer, he felt safer returning them to their spot in the closet, especially if Mark or Alicia were to drop by unexpectedly. He repeated this routine day after day, weaving new sculptures into the expanding Metamorphosis series. Alicia visited often, sometimes glimpsing the scattered clothes, but never pressing him too hard. She saw how alive he was when working, how each new piece radiated a curious blend of power and gentleness. Whenever she asked if she could watch him sculpt in the outfits, he deflected, joking that it was a messy, sweaty process she wouldn't find glamorous in person. She laughed it off, but occasionally gave him looks of gentle concern. At one point, they stayed together for a weekend, trying to enjoy a small break from the intensity of his upcoming deadlines. She made breakfast in the kitchen, humming softly, while he sat at the table sipping coffee. "You've been on my mind," she said, sliding a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. "I can't help but feel there's more going on than you've told me. You always mention the clothes, how helpful they are, but I suspect it's more meaningful than that. Have you been feeling okay?" He paused, setting the mug down. "It's just different, Alicia. When I wear them, I feel like I can tap into a creative zone I never reached before. And not just for reference. There's something about it that calms me, helps me see myself and my art in a new light." She studied him for a moment, then rested a hand on his arm. "It sounds like it gives you a sense of freedom. If it's making you happy, I don't want to stand in the way." He nodded, a wave of gratitude washing over him. "Thank you, really." She squeezed his arm. "I wish you'd let me be part of it, though. I don't want it to become something that isolates you." He didn't know what to say. He knew she spoke from genuine care, but the thought of sharing that private space felt too exposed, too soon. Instead, he gave her a small smile and kissed her forehead, hoping that gesture alone would convey how much he valued her support. The months rolled on, and the Metamorphosis exhibit expanded. He sold several smaller pieces. Galleries clamored for more, praising the originality and honesty in his work. He began hearing from artists across the country who admired his ability to express fluid elements in sculpture without making the pieces feel forced or contrived. Each new success fueled him further, yet the secrecy persisted. He hosted a private viewing in his studio for a few collectors one evening. He made sure all his clothing and personal items were concealed. As they left, praising his talent, he forced a smile, refusing to let them see the heap of garments in his closet that had been the true impetus of his transformation. Meanwhile, Alicia's patience wore thin at times. Though she never gave him an ultimatum, she made it clear that she felt a distance between them, caused by his reluctance to share certain details. He tried to assure her that he cherished her, but an invisible wall seemed to linger. She saw the sculptures, recognized the brilliance, but didn't fully see the private journey that fueled it. One evening, he returned from a gallery meeting to find her waiting in his studio, looking through some of his latest reference sketches. She didn't appear angry, just contemplative. "Hey," he greeted. "Didn't realize you'd be here." She turned. "I used the spare key. I hope it's okay. I was thinking of you and wanted to see your progress. I found some of these sketches." She tapped the page. "I can tell you've drawn yourself in these clothes, but something about the expression on the figure's face feels deeper." Ben set his things down, closing the door behind him. "Maybe it is deeper. It's how I see myself while I'm wearing them, I guess." She gave him a searching look. "I'd like to see it. You dressed like that, not just in a sketch or photo. I want to understand you better." His pulse quickened. He glanced at the closet door. The idea of letting her see him that way made him nervous, but also relieved at the thought that maybe the gap between them could narrow. After a long silence, he murmured, "Are you sure? It might be a lot to take in." She walked up to him, taking his hand. "You've carried so much of this alone. I care about you. I want to be part of what gives you that spark." In a tentative move, he led her to the closet and opened it, revealing the assortment of skirts, dresses, tops, and other items he'd acquired. He could see her eyes widen slightly, but she kept her composure. Quietly, she said, "Can we pick something out together?" He swallowed. A knot formed in his stomach, a mixture of nerves and cautious anticipation. "Okay." She reached for a simple dress with a subtle pattern. She handed it to him, and he stepped behind a folding screen he sometimes used to shield his works in progress. He changed with trembling hands, then emerged. The dress clung to his torso in a way that was unfamiliar but no longer alien. Alicia looked him over, face composed, searching for any hint of distress in his eyes. He stood there, arms stiff at his sides. "This is it," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Now you know what I've been doing." She circled him, observing the way the fabric draped around his shoulders and waist. Then she paused, meeting his gaze. "You look comfortable," she said simply. "And you look like you. I see you in the sculpture now." A sense of relief washed over him. He led her to the spot where he usually took reference photos, showing her the tripod and the lights he'd set up. She seemed fascinated. Together they took a few pictures, just as he would when he was alone, though he kept the angles modest. He explained how he'd move, pausing mid-step, capturing how the material would fold or sway. She watched intently, occasionally glancing at the images on the camera's viewfinder. After a few minutes, she walked up, rested a hand on his shoulder, and gave him a small, supportive smile. That night, they shared a quiet closeness in the studio that neither had experienced before. For the first time, he felt like a piece of the wall between them had slipped away, though he still felt reserved about the entire notion of Benita, the name he'd secretly given himself in these clothes. He sensed that fully unveiling that layer might be too much, too soon. But at least Alicia had witnessed his process, without turning away or acting uncomfortable. In the following days, though, she remained somewhat contemplative. She never disparaged what she'd seen, but she asked cautious questions, trying to understand. "Does it make you want to dress this way more often outside of art?" she asked one evening as they curled up on his couch, the city humming beyond the windows. He paused, the question putting him on edge. "I don't really know," he answered. "Right now it's so tied to sculpting, but sometimes I do like how it feels, even after I'm done working." She nodded, not judging, just listening. "Well, I'm here, for whatever it's worth." He offered a faint smile, then changed the topic to the next sculpture he wanted to create. As the months rolled on, the Metamorphosis series grew in acclaim. More exhibitions asked to show Ben's work. A few well-placed features in art magazines applauded the vulnerability and nuance in his sculptures. People began calling them courageous. Privately, he felt that the truly courageous thing would be to present himself as he truly was in those moments of creation, but that step still felt impossible. He continued living a dual routine, wearing his typical clothes for everyday life, slipping into the women's wardrobe for creative reference and personal exploration in the studio. Alicia's partial acceptance gave him some relief, but he noticed that she didn't bring it up often, perhaps sensing how delicate the topic was for him. In the final stretch of finishing his largest piece yet, a life-sized sculpture of an androgynous figure with arms lifted skyward, he realized how far he'd come from his initial creative slump. The new piece showcased intricate folds carved into the figure's clothing, wide sleeves that seemed to flutter around the forearms. The stance exuded confidence, a pose that dared the viewer to see beyond standard definitions of form. On the night he completed it, sweat dripping down his brow, he stepped back and stared at the figure. It seemed to mirror something he felt inside, a blending of energies that had fueled not just his art, but also an internal shift. Alicia arrived soon after, taking in the sight of the finished piece. "Wow," she breathed, running a hand along one of the carved folds. "I'm speechless," he smiled. "I couldn't have done it without all the referencing I've been doing. And thanks for being here, and for understanding." She turned to face him, searching his eyes. "I understand as much as I can, given what you've chosen to share. I just want to make sure you're not hiding any pain behind it." He pressed his lips together and gave her a small nod, appreciating her empathy, yet still struggling to articulate what he felt. The sense of relief that came with cross-dressing was real, though difficult to explain without stepping into territory that frightened him. In the days that followed, the large sculpture was unveiled at a gallery event. Critics praised it as a bold pinnacle of the Metamorphosis series. Ben found himself swarmed by interview requests, many wanting to know how he managed such an extraordinary exploration of form. He provided what details he felt comfortable sharing, that he had deeply engaged with new methods of referencing drapery and movement, that he'd studied the nuances of body shape for months on end. Sometimes he glanced at Alicia across the room, remembering she had seen more than anyone else, yet not everything. Eventually, the night of that gallery event wound down. After shaking hands with well-wishers, he returned to his studio alone, letting the door close behind him. He set his bag on a stool, exhaling a long breath. In the subdued glow of a floor lamp, he caught his reflection in the mirror. He was still wearing his formal attire from the exhibition: black slacks, a crisp shirt, and a blazer. He stood there, letting the silence wrap around him. His gaze drifted to the closet. He felt a sudden, familiar pull. Slowly, he removed the blazer, then the shirt and pants, until he stood in a plain t-shirt and underwear. Drawing back the closet door, he gazed at the clothes he'd collected. Finally, he chose an ankle-length dress with a flowing skirt, stepped into it, and let the material settle around his body. He carefully zipped it up, feeling the tension of the fabric hugging his torso. Turning to face the mirror, he saw the version of himself that was becoming less foreign. He took a moment to brush aside any lingering doubts. Alone in the studio, he walked around, feeling each shift of the skirt around his legs. He stopped at one of his sculptures, lightly touching the carved folds on its surface. "Thank you," he whispered, perhaps to the art, or perhaps to the reflection in the mirror. He couldn't quite tell which. He wasn't sure what came next. He only knew that this private ritual had become intertwined with his work, that it gave him a sense of clarity he couldn't quite replicate any other way. Perhaps he would never reveal this side of himself fully to the public, or maybe one day he would. For now, the city's lights glittered outside, and the hush of the studio felt like a sanctuary. He drew a breath, smoothing a hand over the fabric at his hip. There in the quiet, he embraced the spark he had found, fully aware that it had brought about his artistic revival. The rest, whether he would show this side to more than just Alicia, remained an open question. But that was enough for tonight. He stepped lightly through his studio, the dress swaying around his ankles, and sat down before a fresh block of clay, feeling once more the creative rush that had saved him from the mire of stagnation. With careful hands, he pressed his thumbs into the smooth surface, letting the shape emerge. In the silence, he worked, fueled by a part of himself he still kept secret, but no longer denied within these walls. The Metamorphosis series would continue, and so would the private practice of cross-dressing that guided him through every graceful line. Even if it remained hidden from most of the world, it was here to stay, anchored in his art and woven into his private moments. And maybe that was precisely the raw edge his sculptures needed, forging each piece into a reflection of the person he was becoming, one fold of fabric at a time.
Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell. For exclusive content and early access, check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.